Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Cardboard Herald, my chance to talk with creative gamers and game creators. And today, joining me from Leder Games, I have Patrick Leder and Cole Wehrle. Welcome back to the show to both of you.
Hey, Thank you.
Yeah, you're living in remote locations. This ain't no Leder office going on right now. How's navigating this whole office dynamic during the COVID pandemic working out for Leder?
Go ahead, Cole.
Oh yeah, I guess. Well, I'm at the office right now, but it's not quite the office as it was. So we do a lot of work together and in close proximity. I mean, usually there's 10 people in this office or 9. And over the course of the pandemic, we shut things down pretty quickly. And it was so funny. I mean, not funny. It was like in the case of Oath, I had just spent like an entire day building these 4 Oath playtesting kits for the 4 local groups that we were running. We ran one night on that Wednesday night. We had, the office was filled with people playtesting stuff. And then I think the office was closed like the next day or the day after.
13th, yeah.
Yep. So it was something like that. It's been interesting. We're running right now with like a skeleton staff at the actual office. Our office is in a highly trafficked building. It's really easy for us to social distance. So we can still sort of share the facilities, but a lot of this pandemic we've spent just doing remotely, which has meant, starting a company Discord and moving all of our playtesting to TTS and really changing how we do development. I mean, all of us are pretty hands-on folks when it comes to the creative work, and so having to move everything to a digital platform has been a little tricky, but I think we've mostly adapted pretty well to its challenges.
TTS is a bear to learn.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're 9 months into this, and I showed a couple of people how to resize ponds today in TTS. So I was like, wow. But the joy of just like taking a prototype and scribbling on a card. This now does 3 reinforcements or whatever the card, whatever you need to do. You just can't do that in TTS. You got to be very, especially for me, my style of design. I just play and change until I have something that I like, and that is just not gelling with TTS right now.
Yeah, and there were, one thing that I will say about TTS is it changed our workflow, and in one thing that I've been reflecting a lot on is when it came to Oaths testing, our playtesting is exhausting, especially for the testers. I mean, they have to go to Kinko's or go to their work printer or something, or their home printer. They have to create a kit. They have to build it, cut it, all the pieces. So in the normal course of playtesting, remote groups have a lot of friction. It takes them a long time. And every iteration you do exhausts your core group. Mm-hmm. But now that we have to build these TTS kits, we are taking all of that friction on ourselves. So now that we we have to do all the work of building this kit. But when we release the kit, all the playtesters, all they have to do is click on it. So it actually made, like in the case of Oath, which was developed, about the second half of the game's development was online. It felt a lot more like managing a video game release, and like we'd have patch notes, and it was a really useful like backwind that kept the enthusiasm among testers up, that we knew that like I could update the cards and none of the playtesters had to worry about anything because it was just instantly in their kit. So there have been some advantages too, and some lessons that we're taking into our general process as we start to imagine what game design looks like after COVID.
Tracking Oath's development since the original announcement and then the Kickstarter, one of the unique things about Leder Games to me is just how transparent you are with the overall development process, and that you announce things so much earlier and you make it available for people to see. I'm wondering if your willingness to show those kind of changes, the immediate iterations, is influenced by the lockdown here, and is that something that you intend to continue even after we're out of quarantine?
Well, one thing I'll say about Oath is when it came to playtesting, I have a few local groups here in the Twin Cities, and Patrick does, and then we have our studio, and then we might have some remote groups. And Oath was different because all of these groups stopped meeting. We suddenly had access to a pool of playtesters that we had never had before. So like there might be like one of my favorite people who I'd loved to have as a playtester. Maybe he's the only person in their group that wants to play. an early game. But because that group's no longer meeting, I can take him again. He can come join our crew. So I've run a lot of playtesting forums in the past,
Right.
but I have never the Oath testing Discord, which was it was a private Discord, but basically anybody who asked could join. So it was kind of like there was an open door. You just had to open it, and there was such a spirit of camaraderie that developed in that group, and it was clear that everyone was just hanging out there. That Discord has like a pet channel. It has a book club. There's like all these like funny side channels that started spawning, and it was clear that like during especially those early months of COVID, these folks were just like kind of hanging out and helping work on the game. And I think this is a place where like the kind of like open development process, which like Patrick has been doing since Vast and those work in progress things, it fed really beautifully into the challenges of what we're running into. Because this is kind of old hat for you, Patrick, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't have much to add.
Well, you mentioned that there's someone in your group who you're like, oh man, this guy would be great to have as a playtester. What makes for an ideal playtester for each of you?
So playtesting has two very distinct phases for me, and I almost wish there was two terms, right? Because when you say playtesting, a lot of people think it's the latter, and I like in my early design process, I am very open to change and changing on the fly. And obviously that is not how you want, you're not going to have the dress rehearsal where you're talking about the actor with notes about how they're going to act. You should have that locked down by then. And so that like there's those two phases where it's like I'm play creating, and then I'm play testing. And my closest group to me is very comfortable with changing things on the fly or suggesting changes to make on the fly, and I like that. We actually haven't really met since the lockdown, unfortunately. That Wednesday group, it kind of fell apart like during the oath testing because they were going to go do some oath. Some of them went to go do oath testing, and it just distance with the lockdown. Also, one of my primary playtesters just his spouse works for the Minnesota Department of Health, and she's been working 1 million hours a week. So he's had to reprioritize games. Games aren't as important right now. So, which I get.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that, especially Patrick's comment about like there being these two phases. Mm-hmm. I find that with the second phase, I'm kind of happy to have anybody come join. But with the first phase, I'm very careful because there's a lot of trust that everyone at the table is going to have the ability to steer the game towards their own preferences. And so you just want to really make sure that you are careful with who you invite to like the dinner party, right? Because that's going to determine the character of the conversation around the game.
Otherwise, you might lose your preferences.
Yeah, exactly. And I, what I'm usually looking for in a playtester, there are kind of like two things. One, they have to be like engaged and be able and interested in like talking about games and to be thinking about better ways of talking about them and putting their feelings into words and kind of sorting through that. And so I want a good participant in that conversation. And then the second really important qualification, and this becomes especially critical in the second half of the process, is they have to be really good at losing and being dispassionate. And that is a hard thing because, I think about when I've been playing a lot of Apex Legends lately and get some other competitive games, and you just like lose a lot. And it's really easy to get like tilt yourself if you start putting emotions and like, oh, I just keep dying in the first drop. I wish I could like live past the first minute once. And then as soon as you think that, it's over because you're going to keep dying and you're going to start getting agitated and ramping up. So I'm always looking for folks that are just really good at rolling with the punches and not like playing with spirit, but also being able to distance themselves. And I think, one of our staff, graphic designers and developers, Nick Brockman, is great at this. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that like he used to play a lot of competitive card games. And so he's just very used to the idea that you default to the position that you're probably going to lose. You'll try hard to win, but it doesn't matter too much.
We just case in point, Cole wasn't even at the computer yet, and we We sent the new Root faction after his keep before he arrived at the table, and the dice just didn't come out. But you could have lost your keep before turn.
I was in a bad spot.
Which is the thing we got to fix, but
right, sort of, but also like those situations will happen, right?
Yeah, and he fought back and didn't. Obviously, he came to the game and didn't really care, but I thought it was funny. Like someone else could have been like, "Dang it," and left the game. But,
yeah, it's a funny balance because you don't want people who are totally dispassionate.
Right.
Like you want them to care,
right?
But you also don't want them to get too emotional about what happened.
It was a bad play for him anyway because
it was borne out. Yep.
Well, especially with feedback and criticism being such an essential part of testing anything, if you can't kind of disconnect yourself from the feeling of being, the loser in a game, then you may actually look for reasons, either consciously or subconsciously, for why the game made you lose, and that may affect your feedback. And I imagine that has to be something that you guys take into consideration whenever you listen to feedback or look at feedback forums or anything like that. Speaking of feedback, the transparency that you have with all these iterations with Oath, I mean, it is awesome that you can make the TTS version of this game so broadly available and get all kinds of feedback and response from fans and interested parties and the Woodland Alliance, the people who just want to be diehard Leder Games fans. But do you feel like that kind of transparency can undermine some of the original creative vision for a product that you're working on? A lot of the reason why some people wouldn't be transparent about this is because they might be worried that the audience isn't necessarily going to get it if they don't see it in a more polished state.
Oath is going to be an interesting experiment in that regard because it is so much more available. Like usually when we're working on testing, once we're done with the game, we don't do the TTS or the print and play until the game's retail release. Mm-hmm. And you do that because you kind of, one, you do it because you don't have time to prepare a game for print and to prepare a print and play release. But the second thing you want to do is you want to kind of like shut the pressure valve and like build up anticipation for a release. And because of COVID, and for other reasons, I think maybe, we just have kind of like kept it going with Oath. And so people are playing like pretty much very close to the release version right now. They're not getting the wonderful physical production, but they're getting the game and all the art and everything. And it'll be interesting to see what happens because a lot of the what we think of as like our core audience, they've played a lot of Oath. They've played 20, 30 games of Oath. And so are those same people going to be excited when the game actually arrives on their doorstep? Or because, I mean, to me, I won't fault anyone if they say like, well, I've already played that game 20 times. Like, my goodness, I'll certainly take that. So I think there is a little bit of an experiment going on, and we're not totally sure how it'll go. But Root was much the same. People kept playing their print and plays during Root, and that was no substitute for the game's physical release. And I think that in general, a big takeaway from Oath has been that like the community has made that game better. We did something with Oath that we had never done before, which is normally when the game goes when we start preparing the production files for a game, we freeze everything. And we do this because we don't want to generate any like editorial liability or like put in a typo in the last minute. I would often tell people that a graphic designer we'd hire something that whenever you make a change in the pre-press process, there's a 25% chance that you introduce another error. So you don't want to make changes in general because you know that you might screw something else up. But with Oath, we had some extra safeguards in place. We had a full-time editor and a full-time graphic designer just doing pre-press. And so because we had more safeguards, more structure, and we really wanted to and we had an active community, we made the call to do something different with our pre-press, which is the way pre-press works is you submit the files, and then there's going to be like a month of back and forth to the factory. For Oath, it was even a little bit more than a month because it's a complicated, big project where you're just like fixing the colors or an icon got messed up. It's very, very mundane. But while we did that, we kept updating the tabletop simulator. And when somebody would ask a question about a card interaction, our editor, Josh Earsley, could say like, okay, actually, this would be clearer if we could put a little clarification on the card. Let's go ahead and do that. And then we would update the game's print files. So it was a strange thing that happened, that we made a lot of very last minute changes to Oath. No design changes, but they were just like clarifications, very, very small adjustments. And we were really bringing in the community. So I think that, the flip side of this is you can exhaust the community doing this kind of work, but if the community is active, we wanted to capture as much of that energy as possible.
We've talked a lot about the road to Oath and the testing and the availability of it at this point, but I'd be remiss if I didn't go back to like some of the original creative vision. So can you tell me, Cole, what was like the original spark for this game? Because conceptually, it's so different than a lot of games out there.
So Oath is like a lot of stuff I've worked on, in that there's like no single moment. There was like no single moment where it made sense. Because I think Patrick and I have talked about this a lot. Like there were we both have been thinking about campaign games for a long time. I had been especially like fretting over the way games end. It's funny, I haven't actually talked about this strand. I feel like whenever someone asks me about the beginnings of Oath, I give them a different answer. But this guy, I think his name's Scott Westerfield, he gave a talk at Shucks about why victory points are bad, and he used the example of Root, and he wasn't wrong, but he had this comment that the game didn't always build to a meaningful climax, and he was making a category error, like books don't behave like novels, right? So don't ask them to have like that beautiful whatever that curve's called that has the rising action and the climax and the falling action. So, but I was thinking about that a lot, and I was just thinking, like, is there a possible way to build a conflict game that is very attuned to narrative structure and that has like climaxes? And so I was thinking about that kind of stuff, and then but at this point, like there were lots of different inspirations, and it wasn't even clear this was a game. It was like just a bunch of scattered thoughts, and then there were a couple moments that crystallized it. One of them was when Patrick and I were driving back from a convention, and we were talking a lot about campaign systems. Mm-hmm. And there's actually, and that conversation itself was an extension of a very early conversation. Probably I had been on the job for maybe a month when we had the first conversation where Patrick, you were talking to me about some stuff in Path. And it was so exciting because it reminded me of things that I've been thinking about from this game I was working on called Scion a million years ago. But just like the idea of a game that changed with its players was just absolutely thrilling. And I think it was just a place where Patrick and I have both been thinking about a lot and comparing notes. And that conversation was extremely generative. But then after that, you have this like very long gestational process. And I kept building versions of Oath that like kind of worked, but I don't even think Patrick played any of them. It was like he might come in the office and I was just like goofing around with.
You'd be like messing around with like this hex map.
Yep.
With a couple like political boundaries on it, and you'd be like, "These are where my giants are," and I'm like, "Cool."
Yeah.
So when you actually had something for Patrick to see, or the whole team to see, Patrick, were you on board at that point?
Oh yeah, I mean I was on board at the hex map point. So especially after the success of Root, I was willing to throw the keys to Cole pretty early in the process. Anyway. It's kind of funny because I really wasn't in the office much when you turned on Oath. Really? Yes.
Yeah, because Oath was kind of in a bad. It wasn't a bad. It was just it wasn't moving when you left.
Yeah. Well, it's, So I had a baby. You had a baby in September.
Yes.
Of 2019. I had a baby not me personally. My spouse did. In November of 2019, and it was a rough transition for us, and it's our second child, or he is our second child, but it wasn't. It was a little bit tricky of a delivery, and and so I was just gone, and then I come back, and like you guys are like 6 weeks into playing this game, and it's firing, and I played it, and I was like, oh, I feel very old, but it's a combination of sleep deprivation and the game itself, and then just jumping into this meta that Nick and Cole and Josh had already had going, basically because they had been playing it. So, but no, I was very excited about it right away, and then he talks about that conversation, which is important. Maybe we should just drive somewhere for 6 hours again, Cole, and then we'll,
Mhm.
I haven't finished Path yet though, so
Yeah,
maybe,
so it can be the path trip.
so we gotta finish Path, but then we can have another conversation, and we can start to work on a game together, and then realize that we can't work on a game together and go work on 2 separate games. Oath and Path, it's kind of weird. They're like 1 letter off from each other. Strange. Where was I? So yeah, I bought in really early. Cole, like, what Cole doesn't tell about the story too is there was this amazing pitch meeting very early on where, like, Cole comes in and I'm like, show me what you got. I need to know soon. I'm getting tense about this. I think this is when we're at the Vandalia building still. And we sit down and we have this big company-wide meeting, which at the time was not that big. And then, like, Kyle starts talking about the art, and you start talking about the different groups coming together and how they'll come into play. And and that was back when you still had, like, if the demons rule, then it's going to be this victory condition, and if this so-and-so rules, it's going to be this victory condition. And it was an amazing pitch because neither of them had really coordinated it. I figured out later. And it was the closest analogy I can say. It was like giving a high five in the dark. The pitch was so smooth. I thought that they had planned it out, and it was basically like, well, Kyle's like, I'm going to do all this, and we're going to have these guys are going to be the wizards that control the setting, which turned into the player characters. They're not really they're not wizards now, right. but that's what they were then. One of them even retained I think the red pawn is still kind of a jackally looking person. And that all came over, and that was the point. I was like, all right, if you guys can deliver that, then I'm on board. So
it's so funny looking at, like, that conversation. What was crazy because Kyle and I had, like, lightly talked about something we wanted to work with, but I was not aware of the existence of this game that Kyle had been working on that fed, like, just beautifully into. I mean, it was really remarkable.
I'm so salty about the title. They were calling it Morg back then, and I was like, Morg's pretty cool. Oath is very cool. I'm just teasing.
Has there, throughout the development, ever been points of actual contention between you two about certain aspects of the game?
Not with Oath.
I've been pretty hands off.
Yeah, I mean, I think Oath is like, you've been working on a lot of other things. You've been playing Oath, but I think that, I mean, you're going to run into disagreements. Like, I actually, it's like when I think about the folks who were spending a lot of time working on Oath, where it was mostly developed by myself and Josh and Nick, and we definitely got into some arguments. And I think part of it is, like, you just care too much, right? And I had to have, like, there was more than one time where either I had to give this talk to someone else or someone else had to give it to me, where they were like, hey, you are too focused on something that's very small. Right. And you have to, like, back out and let's like take a look at the whole picture. And I think Oath was so complicated that there needed to be, not as a design, but just as, like, a project, that there just had to be a lot of people helping. And so I felt like my design work. So for the Oath card base, so Oath has 250 unique cards or so, and I did the primary design on, like, probably 160 of them, or 170 maybe, and then the other design was done by either Josh or Nick or Patrick had a suggestion, or, like, lots of people, the playtesters, and I think for the second half of the project, I felt much more like a conductor than like an author in a cave. It felt a lot like, okay, everyone's doing good work. I just need to mostly make sure that everyone's contribution is gelling with the full thing
and plays together. Yeah,
and plays together. And I think that, like, that. So, like, conflict is then part of that process, but it's a part that you just have to, you can't avoid it. You just have to be able to work through it.
I think there was a point where we play tested it. You were like, I'm concerned about this. And then I said, here's the solution for this. And you were like, yeah, and here it already is laid out. And it was putting drag on the player's turns based on number of armies, I think.
Yeah.
It was in there. And I was like, well, you just gotta, and I was like, well, all right then.
Yeah, sometimes
I'm glad we agree.
Yeah. That definitely happens too.
Was there any aspect of the game that you were super passionate about, but you had to sacrifice for the sake of making a better game?
Ooh, that's a hard question for Oath. It's like I can give that question for
The
Root.
title.
Well, let's hear it for Root. Let's
Yeah.
let that
Well,
be the
so
warm up.
okay, but Oath is very funny because what happened with Oath's development, and this is unique as far as any product I've worked on, is Oath had a simple initial design. It got very complicated, and then it got reduced back to kind of that simple core in a way that was like sometimes like eerie. How it was like, oh wow, actually we are just going to go back to that very simple basic system. And so like a lot of stuff did get cut out of Oath, but it got cut in a way that I was like not sad about. I was like gleeful when we got the rules down to as long as they are. With Root, there were lots of things cut. I mean, the example that I think is on Patrick's mind, it's on mine, is like the alternate win conditions in Root, which
I miss them.
Yeah, I want them to work. I just want them to work. I don't know. I got a message from somebody. I bet Patrick got this message too, who was like, I really miss them. I miss these alternate conditions. I will like buy you lunch if you can put them in.
Well,
Like, it was, you know, this person said like, hey, I like Root just fine. I think it's a great game, but my favorite board gaming experience ever was played with like the second to last playtest kit or like the Kickstarter
and
playtest
taking
kit.
the keep. That's always my like, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And
there's
it's
still
just
always room to bring it back in. You got expansions. You even have an expansion just on the horizon.
Oh no.
Come on, just
Seriously.
bolt it on.
Access.
People would buy it. That's how you make money, right? Just give the people what they want. Who cares about balance?
I think I agree with Cole. I think it's good to make sure that the like Root is very flexible as it is, and to make two sets of rules is kind of dangerous. So,
Yeah, totally.
yeah, I missed those alternate victory conditions. So, like I said, there was the Woodland Alliance could win by storming the keep or sieging the keep or something like that. And that's kind of where the dominance win came from, is you want to put a lot of pieces in one spot. And it was narratively just hilarious. Like it was like this moment where you're like, ha, like I have to throw. And the Woodland Alliance had trouble getting troops on the board too back then, so it was very special moment when you could get that many guys on the board and then do it, or folks on the board. Though, I mean, really, you kind of explored that with Oath, and then I think you're gonna explore that sudden victory death, or that sudden death space in Void Lich. And Vast definitely had.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, that's Vast bread and butter.
It is funny how much the Leader games are like direct. They're in such conversation with each other. Like, and I think sometimes people miss this about Root, because Root is such a reaction to Vast.
Yeah.
And not like a critique of it. It's such like okay, what parts of Vast work? What parts don't work as well? Is there a way that we can square these things? And then when I think about Oath is like a complete reaction to Root. And Void Lich is very much like a reaction.
I've heard you say things about Void Lich that are like, well, you're responding to Oath.
Yeah, I'm like, clearly trying to process that stuff through. I mean, I think that both of us have a design sensibility that is pretty liberal with like harvesting parts from previous work. So it's so funny because I used to have this be a point of contrast between us, Patrick, because I always thought like I really only have like one active project and then maybe like a future project, whereas you have like several projects. But I think that we both like are really aggressive about taking stuff from things that haven't quite started working yet. So like, just to get back to your question about systems that I was sad to destroy in Oath, I had a combat system that I really liked that was very much like my critique of Dune's combat. Mm-hmm. I thought it was dope. I thought it was really interesting. It just could not work. It was like fundamentally unworkable, and I was very sad to see it go. But it was just completely obvious it had to go, and that system has already informed other stuff that I'm working on,
which won't work.
Yeah, which won't work, and then I'll get sad again and throw it.
Well, let's talk about the lineage of Leder games. I mean, I know that before Vast came out, that Leder had put out games, but Vast was the big breakthrough, and then there was Root, and at the time, a lot of people, probably dumb people like myself, would be like, yo, Leder Games, they're the people who make asymmetric games. That is the identity, the core shit that Leder Games is going to put out. But now, here at the tail end of 2020, you have Fort, you have Oath on the horizon, and I don't even really know that much about Void Lich. I feel like you could make a lot of assumptions about what a Leder game is going to be or supposed to represent a couple of years ago. Patrick, do you feel like the identity of the company has shifted, and maybe your intent of what Leder's scope is?
Yeah, and I don't like. I think the identity was a little bit assigned to me, and I played into it, of course, because it was a good angle to market the company when we were growing. But now we have, I hate to say that, maybe we have the clout to publish other. We definitely have. We've definitely published other things at this point, as you just said. So yeah, for me, it was the. I was working on, I did publish Trick or Treat. I was working in more complicated designs, and Trick or Treat's goal was to just teach me the publishing process, right? Because it's just a double deck box. It's nothing complicated to it. There's still like 100 left in the warehouse if anybody wants to get one. It's almost gone. And so coming out of that, I was working on some dungeon crawler thing, and I discovered Vast, and of course made the pitch for it right away. And out of that, though, David initially said no, and he wanted to work with another publisher. And so what I did was I started talking to David about thinking that David was some like design guru, but it turned out that was his first design, and he just kind of like and that was great, because he designed something original because he had no frame of reference about the rest of the industry. And so he was like, how do I tell this very complicated story well divided up among the players to each take a role in that story? And so I started working with him on other designs, and I was working on this game called Giant at the time. And just think, if a Giant had been published, we'd be doing 5-letter. And so we're working on Giant together, and he kind of like laid out for me the structure of how he how he made every group adversarial with the other group, and how you block the other, how you block the other groups. And that seems obvious, but at the time it was really informative and interesting. And so I designed Giant, and then Giant started breaking down into other projects because it was too big, it was too unwieldy. So I started like figuring out other things. And Path actually does come directly from that work on Giant. Like there was a version of Giant where the players are controlling the victory conditions by spending influence on the factions in the game, and then as they do jobs, to use the root setting, which is where Path is now, if you are famous in the Marquise's court and you're doing bounty hunter missions, then you get more points. Or if other players are doing bounty hunter missions while you're well invested in the cat's court, then you still would be getting points for that. And so that was one of the aspects of Giant that split out of it. So yeah, but then of course, he came to us and said, let's do Vast together. And he unfortunately had to drop out of the process due to some family issues. And but then I took over and created that asymmetric design. What it did teach us, though, was that it is, and especially working on TMM afterwards, if Cole will agree, it's just a big teach. I love Vast. In fact, I worked on Vast 3 last weekend for funsies, and or to gain experience points, or whatever, however we want to talk about it. And but it's when you get to a convention and you're spending 20 minutes just explaining the 4 turns to somebody, it's a bit of a bear to teach. And so I think one of the goals of Root, in my mind, as the producer, and Cole walked right into this and started working on it, was how to make the asymmetry so that there's a common enough language that's easy to express between the roles, which is, movement and combat is very similar. So you just have to explain that once. You don't have to explain combat a million times. And then there's just things that change it. And then, having a scoring system versus a sudden death victory system allowed players to track the game state much easier. And so I think that's the kind of lineage it grew out of. But from there, I think when I started designing Void Lich, one of the goals of it was to make a world where to reduce the asymmetry of Root even further, and I at the time I said my intent with the asymmetry was to make it somewhere between Twilight Imperium and Root, where you still play Twilight Imperium generally very similar, but there is enough asymmetry between the what are they called, factions?
Yeah, I don't know.
Nations,
right,
yeah.
Right.
So between the races, maybe, yeah. Mm-hmm. So between the species, there's enough rule changes that you still feel that the asymmetric wheel turning a little bit, especially I think of the players that really play with the action cards. Mm-hmm. But it's not. But you're still playing a very similar game to each other. So some are a little bit past that, but before Root for asymmetry. And then, I think now the goal for Void Lich is to make the asymmetry emergent, is kind of how I describe that. Is that?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, go ahead.
And with Oath, it's emergent too, in some sense. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, I see discussions about Oath's asymmetry a lot on the Will and Warriors Discord and in other places. And it's interesting because if you were to just line up the powers in Oath and the victory conditions, it is closer to Vast than Root in asymmetry, just because, like, if you ask someone, how do you win in Root, there are some commonalities about how the victory points work generally, right? And when you're playing Oath, it's like, okay, I win if I can sneak into the castle and steal the scepter and run out to the desert. And he wins if he can start a revolt, like, out, in this area. And so, like, they're just really different player positions, even though it's relying on a kind of shared set of rules. The way I've tended to think about the company's like governing style or mission is that fundamentally we do thematic immersive games,
right?
And Vast is one, and Root is one, and Oath is one, and a lot of companies that are our size tend not to do games like this because they're expensive. They're expensive in terms of development, in terms of art. They're expensive in every way a game can be expensive, basically. But our ethos, our style is that, like, the players get to drive a lot of that theme, that it's immersive, that it's gonna put the players first. And it's funny, when I first started working here, I remember telling Patrick one of the things I was so attracted to about the way Vast was the way it comported itself. Vast has a seldom commented, but I think it's very charming, like kind of a retro feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
like totally. Yeah. I don't see people to talk about it, but I look at the Vast books and I'm like, this kind of looks like an 80s role-playing game, just in the way it like comports itself.
But of course, it feels like an 80s game sometimes.
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
Sensibility.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that the art is so hand-drawn that you really see, like, it doesn't look too polished. It doesn't have that like sheen that like a lot of modern game art has. Not that there's anything wrong with it, of course. But it, like, just in its whole spirit, it has this like kind of like spunky, like 80s school of design to it. Despite the fact that, on the other hand, Vast, especially the first game in the series, it has a very modern design sensibility. Like the way the different factions behaves. Like, Patrick, I could see you doing a lot of the like reaction to first and second wave Euros in that design. And so, like, it had a modern design sensibility, but it's like heart. Like the song it wanted to play was like an 80s song.
It's Mid-Atlantic.
yeah, exactly. So to me, like that. So when I think about like what does the company do, at least right now, I mean, of course, it's always changing. When we're at conventions and stuff, and someone asks me like, "Oh, what kind of games do you guys make here?" I always say like, "Well, these are games that are really immersive. They're really player driven, very story first, but you are going to be determining the story." And they're really interactive. And ultimately, like, and I love turning away people at our booth. The question I'll ask them is like, hey, do you like to play one game a lot of times? Because that's kind of our bag.
Yeah.
We just have to own it a little bit because it allows us to play by a different set of rules than a publisher that knows that they're trying to win you in the first 5 minutes.
So, but to piggyback on that, what I'll say is when I was getting into the market, I felt like there was a real push. So Kickstarter, and not, Kickstarter's my bread and butter, so I'm not criticizing it, but what it was doing, I had a friend who went to like a meetup in Austin for designers, and this guy, several people showed up one meeting he'd never met before, and one of them just launched into this long thing about how his game was going to market and how he's going to produce it. And it's kind of like raising your hand on the first day of a college class and saying, what do I need to do to get an A in here? Instead of saying, what do I intend to learn here?
Right,
I felt like they were like way, the cart was way before the horse if they're talking about the marketing of the game, because they're like, I'm not focused on making an authentic, fun experience. I'm focused on how to make it as a producer in this industry. And I always want to focus on the experience that the player's having. I like the money is great, but the money just lets me continue building an authentic experience. And so like where am I going with this? And so that, like, when I got into the industry, I felt like if you looked at people who were always bemoaning when they'd play a game with me and they'd say, why can't you make a simpler game? Why can't you make a Ticket to Ride? Why can't you make a Carcassonne? Like, which just gets down to the essential elements of that design. And they're great designs. I love Carcassonne. I'm a little over Carcassonne, but I'll play Ticket to Ride any day of the week. That's fine. And that's just because I played a lot of Carcassonne. So I think what we did was I said, I'm just going to embrace, like, I'm not going to keep racing towards easy or simpler. And that is a great aesthetic. Embrace it if that's how you want to design, or if that is what you are skilled at doing. But what I wanted to do was to answer the call of people were saying, I get burned out on games really fast. And I'm like, well, yes, because you're playing something that is very, like, it has a repetitive turn structure, repetitive flow. I want to make a game for you that you can sink your teeth into and get into and keep playing over and over and enjoy for a long time. And I don't want you to keep filling up your shelves as I stand in a room full of games. I don't want to keep filling up your shelves with games that aren't going to satisfy you. And then the other part about the aesthetic I wanted to talk about was that there's an interview with Peter Molyneux, who's a British. Is that the right?
Yeah.
We say British, yeah.
Lionhead Studios.
Lionhead Studios, yeah. He made Fable. He made, frankly, some of my favorite games from my childhood when he was working for Bullfrog. And when he designed Fable, he was talking about how there was behavior people were taking in the game that he had not anticipated when he designed the game. And one of them was he would get people drunk. So players would get people drunk and get them to follow them outside of town, and then they would impress these people with spells or something like that until they were in a stupor, and then the player would run back to their town and steal everything. Obviously, that's just game breaking. That isn't very interesting to me. But he then talked a lot about emergent gameplay, and that notion has always been interesting to me. And I think it is hard to pull off in a computer game because you can see all the parts much more easily than you can see the math in a video game. But for me, that's kind of like where I want to go to by the end is I want to get to this like world where I see someone playing it and I go, I had no idea you could do this with the game, but it's not off the rails yet. So
that is a very nice summary of like when I feel like I know a game is getting close to being done.
Yes.
Is when I start to see players do, like, there was a late stage Oath playtest where players there's a card called the Tinker's Fair, which allows players to trade relics and negotiate for them. Normally you can't do that. It's one of those rules of game design that's like, be careful, don't let players trade things, they'll break your game. So in Oath there are powers that kind of open up that type of gameplay. But I saw notes about a game where players were renting their relics to each other. So they'd be like, hey, $2, you can borrow this for a turn and a half, and then you got to give it back. And it was just so delightful because it was not really how that card was intended to work, but it was clear that the players had found like an emergent character for that game that fit perfectly within the general theme, and it wasn't something I had anticipated. I'm like, okay, we can shut it down. Game's done.
I love it.
Well, we've talked a lot about the stuff that's just about to come out. I mean, Oath is on the horizon. I know it's still TBD as far as specific date that it's going to be available in retail, but you also have a lot of projects in development. Patrick, you mentioned you were dabbling with Vast 3. I mean, is that a reality on the horizon? Is that just
no.
A little tinkering project for you?
Yeah, it was a little bit of tinkering. I had designed, so back when we were working on Mysterious Manor, I had approached it as I was making Crystal Caverns, and I wanted to like try to see what would happen if I just made a true expansion for Crystal Caverns. So I designed this thing about an ice cave, and everything had an ice like sort of shift to it. So the ice dragon, creepy cave, I think is what I called it. And so what I did was I basically kind of just designed it like similar but slightly more, not complicated, but slightly deeper roles based on the Crystal Caverns. So that was, and I was going to call that the depth expansion. And then I also designed Mysterious Manor, which was width, and that was if you just take the roles over to a new game and rewrite the game, what do you end up with? And Mysterious Manor won that moment, like that's the one we ended up going with. And turns out that was tricky to market because people wanted the expansion and not or thought it was an expansion and not a new core game. And so as I got closer to realizing the core game was going to work, there was a day, maybe 2018, where I rewrote all the the Frozen Fear, which is what it ended up being called. I rewrote all those rules to work independently of the Crystal Caverns, but I got stuck on the setting horror or the fear, like the actual setting and how to make it, because before it had just been like a flavor of the cave, and so now I wanted to make a new setting, and I have notes for good interviewmanship here, Patrick. Keeping your phone on.
Hey, we're all in 2020 experiencing this. This is the norm now. I mean, that's flavor. That's what that is. That's what flavor, the people want to see.
Well, I could have done this upstairs with kids in the background. And so I'd redesigned it, and I was like, okay, well, I'm just going to shelve this, and someday I'm going to have an idea for how the fear works. And then this weekend, like, my brain was like, here you are. 2 years later, this is how the fear is going to work. And so I just sat down and redesigned the fear, and then that led to me redesigning all the other roles, because I was like, well, it all has to fit together. And I did that it was probably less than 6 hours of work to design it. Now, of course, I got to prototype it and build it, but yeah, so that's just for passion. But we're working on Route 4, which will be the next. We haven't decided on a title. We haven't even discussed a title for Route.
Yeah, we haven't even started that conversation.
And so we're kind of dividing up the responsibilities here and making it more of a studio project. And so right now I am working on 2 more militant factions for the game, as militant being a faction that has to police the game state to make sure that they can get to victory.
Yeah, I think of those as the factions that stabilize the board. You're going to need one of those in play. Someone has got to be the moles or the cats or the eerie.
And that was the impetus behind designing them. Was we figured, well, if you're going to target high reach groups in the game, then let's give players more options in case that's what they want. It also stabilizes 2-player a little bit, because both of these should work as an anchor for a 2-player game. I don't see any reason why neither of them work yet.
No, they should both work just fine.
I would look forward to playing the warlords versus the cats across the entire board, and not next door. And so that was one goal. And then we talked about and so then Cole is designing. We talked about extending the player ranges a little bit, so making 2-player a little bit more satisfying, and making 5 or 6-player, which I think we've kind of dropped from the project. I guess we're kind of.
I think it's still there. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We had Patrick had a good idea for kind of a way to extend the board potentially, and have bigger maps for the groups that want to play on the bigger map, because there are people out there. It's not me, but there are people out there, Patrick, who like root at the high count.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I may not have commented on it, Patrick, but I read Dan's thread. I read that about Dan Thoreau, the reviewer, was like, I kind of want to play root with 8 people. And it's like, well, you can't really do that on the 12 clearing map, but a 15 clearing map.
Yeah, I might. Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
So as Patrick said, this root content is definitely like a studio project. And what we mean by that is it's all hands on deck. Everyone's helping.
Yeah.
Everyone's got ideas. We're all putting stuff in the broth. The thing that I'm mostly working on is
So the other side is the two.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I didn't want to steal. Didn't want to steal your thunder. The other side is the two player, and the two player has an interesting provenance. Basically, many elements of root are very modular and very easy to expand.
Mm-hmm.
But there is one system part that does not expand very cleanly, and that's the game setup. It works fine, but it doesn't socket as neatly as the other ones do when it comes to having a lot of content. So I am in the process. Basically, I kind of looked at the problems, as we were kind of divvying up tasks and thinking about different ways of going. And Patrick had been working a little bit on the two player, and I was working on the setup. And then it occurred to me that actually I kind of wanted to work on the two player as well as the setup, as well as helping with any balance adjustments to the system, because all those issues were like very tightly interrelated. And so I'm working on a new advanced setup system, which will plug very seamlessly into the tournament style draft that a lot of people who run root tournaments use. We're basically going to adapt that system, make it official, and then build it directly into the setup so that you can get around with some friends. You can very quickly make a pool of factions and then draft those factions. And as part of the draft, you're setting up the board. And then if you're playing at lower player counts, we have these like little minor factions that players will fight for control over that allow the low player count game to still feel populated. And it's a little bit different than the bots. Like when you're playing with the bots, there's a very subtle like cooperative element when you're playing with the bots, right?
Right.
Because
right.
And I think that's actually something that the bots are very good at. And I don't want to take any of the bots' thunder when it comes to like what they add to the game. When you play with the minor factions, it feels like you're playing more of a war game.
Okay, so this is blowing my mind. Minor factions are going to be in a root. So, like, give me kind of like a practical example, to the extent that you feel comfortable sharing,
Sure. No, totally.
of what this is.
So the way it works, and this is again caveat: is all this stuff's in development. It could change a million times. The way the minor factions work is they are color coded to the major factions. They use different pieces. Maybe the piece shape might be different, and they'll come in a little tuck box, and they are kind of like a flavor of the major factions. So, like for instance, the Woodland Alliance one is called the Spring Uprising.
I love this.
Right, and basically what it does is it's this little minor faction that players can bid for control on using a currency that I'll talk about in a second, and then on your turn you get to like put little unrest tokens down, which behave mostly like sympathy, and then can also cause revolts. But they don't have warriors. They don't score victory points. They're just a pawn. But you have to be careful because you could build a bunch of sympathy webs on the board, and then you might lose control of the Spring Uprising, and now it's the other player who's holding the gun that you've been crafting for the whole game. This is powered by a pretty simple sort of zero-sum influence economy that pays players who are struggling in the game. So if you have the fewest points, if you've been getting the snot kicked out of you in combat, you're going to have more of these little influence points, which you can use to bid for control on these different factions. The other element to this is you can also bid for turn order. For who gets to go first, and it gives the game it gives the players a lot of tempo control, which is actually not something that players have ever had in Root, right? Like Root is a game about tempo where you don't get to control the tempo, and you just have to understand like the what the natural balance of the table is depending on seating order and factions. And when you play with the minor factions, it gives players a lot like, is it more valuable for me to take control of like the weird lizard minor faction or to be first player next round?
I'm excited about this because I've been watching a lot of 40K lately, and I like because it's not A-B for turns. Now you have to roll for initiative each turn. There is this like, you cannot leave yourself in a position that's vulnerable because someone might double up on your turn. And so I'm interested to see how that sort of behavior translates to Root.
Well, this is a pretty fundamental shift because Root isn't a game that has rounds built into it from the get-go. So is this going to be the default way of playing from now on if you're using any element of this expansion? Is this a variant?
So this is a thing that I have very mixed feelings about, but I'm growing more comfortable with it as I live in the space. It is essentially like the first modular option for Root. So all of the existing setup stuff, all the existing setups rules, those all are still there. And then players can make the choice to play with the advanced setup, which then brings in minor factions, it brings in the tempo stuff and all. So, but I should be very clear about this. For the new expansion, you can play with the factions in any form.
Yeah,
You could just drop like that. We are not upsetting the apple cart at all there. If you want to play with the new factions or if we do new maps, all that stuff still works just fine. But then for the players who have gotten really into the game, especially like on the competitive side, you will have this sort of advanced setup system that plugs in with the minor factions. And it's not really that complicated, but it does change the character of the game a little bit.
And the minor factions, they could be played at any player count. It just enriches two-player, which is one of the more lacking ways of playing.
We're like still trying to figure it out precisely. It'll be something like 3 minor factions in the 2-player game. You use 2 for 3 and 4, and just 1 for 5 and more. We haven't quite figured out those numbers. Most of the testing I've done has been with 2 and 3 players. We're still pretty early on, and it's so interesting. I feel like with the design of the minor factions, this has been a place where we have been play. So we play a lot of games in studio, and I think this has been a place where this has been a good place where the studio system has been a real strength. So for instance, like the bidding for turn order thing came from playing a lot of Undaunted with the development, our developer Nick Brockman, and we were just talking about the importance of tempo in war games. And there are these old Civil War games where I think the GMT's the Civil War has this great mechanism where when we decide who goes first, we both roll a die, and then the higher roll goes first, and you take as many actions as the differential between the two dice. It's a great mechanism. It's a great mechanism because you could play a very aggressive and dangerous play, hoping that you're going to get to go again, right? And so, also, we've been having conversation. Like Patrick had made when Patrick was thinking about the 2-player, he made a comment about like the problem with Root's combat is that if it's just me and you, and I roll really well, there is no third player that can like help fix that problem.
Totally.
Right. And so that led to a way of getting influence where if zeros are rolled on the die, the defender, who's the one who was hurt by that 0, is going to generate some extra currency, which they can use to then take bids that are going to improve their setup position. So far, the advanced setup has been very, very, very tight. And one of the weird things about Root is that not many games of Root get to the end game. It's a rare thing. A lot of games of Root end at the 7-turn mark or before. Mm-hmm. And the end game of Root, where everybody has like 23 points, but no one really has the ability to score that last 7. It's my favorite part of the game, and it just doesn't happen that often. But this, so far, has been taking a lot of the games I've played to that end game, which is really exciting.
That's cool. Can you send me some photos of the game in progress?
Oh yeah,
in studio. I haven't even seen.
Oh yeah. I will. I should take.
You send me the assets, and I'll load them into TTS for you.
Yeah. No, I was gonna put them into TTS on Monday, so they're all
okay. Cool.
They're all ready to go.
Patrick, you said that you're working on 2 militant factions. Are these the only factions that right now you're planning on having in the expansion?
Yeah, I think so. I know so. I mean, I did want to give. There's other major factions at the studio we should probably give a shake to also, but we haven't really. I just kind of how the timing of us going back to work from home worked out. It made sense for me just jam on the 2 militant factions alone. But yeah, for right now, that's it. Now, one thing that was also exciting to me is some of the kind of half factions you see from the fan factions or from even the studio generating stuff can plug in very easily as a minor faction, and so you might see an expansion someday that's just. Here's 2 minor factions.
I think that's a brilliant way of incorporating all kinds of new fun stuff into what is otherwise, a really simple system. I mean, that's one of the things that I love most about Root, and I've found that your guys' hope of having games that reward repeated play has absolutely come true with Root. The more that I play, the more that it kind of elevates in my mind of my favorite games. And part of that is that I like that fundamentally Root is kind of a simple framework, and the complexity comes from two things. One is, of course, the asymmetry and all the different things that a faction can do. But two is the strategic possibilities that are left up to you in that simple framework. I mean, it's almost shocking when you realize how simple movement works and combat works and that kind of stuff. But by the amount of interaction that you can have, the possibilities are pretty numerous. And as you're describing these minor factions, it's just sounding awesome. But I want to know about the new major factions. These two militant factions. What can you share about them? First, do you have the animals on lockdown?
Yeah. So I gotta kick one thing back to Cole. Cole, real quick.
Mm-hmm.
And you start a new design. Do you start with the Root movement and combat rules?
Yes, a little bit. Oh man,
as do I.
Yeah. No, it's so funny. I've been working. Yeah, I've been working on this, I know we'll probably talk about it a little bit more. But because I want to hear you talk about the new factions. But when I started working on a design take for the space game that we've been working on, I literally was like, okay, I have a new action framework. Let's just play Root with this action framework.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to think about movement and adjacency and combat. Let's just play Root with the new action framework. And then as soon as I got that working, I was like, okay, now I can start to customize the rest of the chassis to meet the action framework. But yeah, no, I use that system all the time now.
All right, so we are working on two factions right now. The Warlord of the Rats. I guess we got to come up with the title. Warlords is great because it is the structure of their society.
I like Warlord.
Yeah. But they'll be represented by rats in the game with personalities like the Vagabonds. There's a single piece that is the Warlord itself, and they'll be they'll have a character card that has a personality or a different ability as how that's expressed in the game. And so the faction tends to focus on hegemony, like ruling clearings completely, and it focuses on the motion of the Warlord across the board and how they're the ones that are the center of the fighting, and they're the ones at the center of the action. And as they move away from you, they lose that presence basically. And so everything has to kind of take place around the Warlord. And if the Warlord dies, we want player to take risks. I think we hit on the right formula for how much it's going to hurt to lose the Warlord, which is not as much as losing your government in as the Erie, for instance. So that's working on that. And then we had announced that we were doing a turtle faction, and it was going to be another militant faction, and they depend on public buildings and building public roads, and slow levying and a kind of a defensive play. But I think we're going to go with Badgers instead. So I'll just go ahead and announce that. I feel bad.
It's like not final,
people
right?
Talking about turtles on Twitter, and I'm like, well, actually,
it's like, it isn't settled. I feel really good about their design where they're at. I think they're really interesting. It's weird. Sometimes I feel like, sometimes the animal comes first, and sometimes the design comes first.
Well, tell me about how Badgers play.
So they and they're not quite. We have not played nearly as many games with them yet because they just came out second, and we're trying to get the Warlord looking better first. And the Warlords, frankly, I think it's testing well.
I think it is like a few weeks from being able to drop some public testing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the Badgers then they just have a few buildings that they can build, and to represent kind of a slower form of governance, they have action tokens that they have to put down on the map, and then And this is all work in progress, bound to change.
Totally.
Yeah. So they put tokens down on the map, and those will be their orders in the next turn. And so they have to kind of plan out their, and players can see what they're planning on doing next turn. There's still orders in their pool that they can play if they need to, but those aren't as strong as the ones that are on the map. So you really want to lean on the ones on the map when you're playing. So, and then a little bit defensive, but slower to get guys on the board, and that seems to be the right combination. I'm really enjoying them. There's a lot of when I've been playing them, there's a lot of cost to movement, and so it's like, how many do you have to make your invasion forces not be 6 guys jumping on a space? You want to make your invasion 2 or 3 guys jumping on a space, taking it down, and then bringing in more troops afterwards for free. And so I like the tension that creates, because there's a lot of like, do I go for it and risk losing this position, or do I hold back and wait until everything's a little bit more solid? So,
and they have this awesome system that Patrick came up with for like public infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So like they can build like roads that other people can use. So they're in this funny like, so it's interesting. Like I see the Warlord as very much like an interesting like take on an Eerie style invader style faction, and the Badgers are like, what if the Otters? What if that kind of faction had grown up into a bigger more militant faction?
They want to take care of people,
and they want to take care. Yeah, so like I think that they will pair really well against each other in 2-player matchups. But they also like gel well with the other factions. I mean, I think when Patrick was soliciting ideas for the expansion, and everybody was adding to this Google Doc, I wrote this like tiny little paragraph that was like, what root faction should do. And it's like, one, they should be aware of what other factions do so that they're scouting out new territory, right? And then the other thing is that they need to make the whole game should feel that they're present in a way that, like, when you play with the Otters, you're playing with the Otters. This game is different, and it would feel very different if the Otters were the Woodland Alliance instead. And
that's why I think it's funny you said the game's finally modular. The rules are modular, because I'm like, well, the factions themselves are modular.
Yeah, but yeah. It's almost like there's a variant. Maybe that's there you go. The ickier word that I don't want to say. But like I do think that there's both of these factions that Patrick's built, like they clear those marks very, very easily. And there's still a lot of work to do on them, but like the Warlord is like pretty much ready to go. So hopefully we'll have some print and play. And just going back to that first question about process, like this is another development that we're going to be doing publicly. Like people can join the Woodland Warriors Discord, and they can get to see this stuff early. So
when is this going up? So I'll first start seeing the ire about the animal changing.
Yeah. I'll probably have this up in about a week, and you can expect all the hate mail then.
There'll be frogs by then.
I'll get it. Yeah, I'll get it.
So the development, I imagine, has had to have evolved as Root has become more and more complex, because initially you're only testing 4 factions against one another, and different player counts within that. You had 2-player, the original Mechanical Marquise, and then 3 and 4. Has it become exponentially more difficult to figure out how to get factions into this game? Do you see an end of the road where Root might be complete because it's just too ridiculous to introduce more factions into this thing?
So, may I call?
No, go ahead.
I'm tapped out. I felt like it was a stretch to get to where I'm at with these 2 militant factions, and it was good. I like the constraint of the. I had 2 constraints, because I have the constraint of the design that we have right now, and I also have the constraint of. I have 3 constraints. I see notes from Cole about what he wants to do in the future, and I didn't want to violate that space at all. And I think there was an original take I had on one of the militant factions that we could have done, and I was like, I could see where both of these could play together, but let's not cross that bridge, because I don't want to limit Cole's design in the future, because he's not done. And then and also I'm pretty active with people talking about the fan factions, and I didn't want to. I like the creativity of the fan factions, and there's a lot of interesting ideas that aren't quite complete there yet, or are far more complicated than, say, the Vagabond. And so it's like, you got to and I mean, the Warlord still has plenty of rules to cut. But I felt that constraint too, because I didn't want to be like, oh yeah, I played this faction a couple weeks ago, and now here's this thing I used from this. Even though some people have even said to me, go ahead and use parts of this if you want to. And so like there was those three constraints of how do I get under that. And actually, to be honest, that the fan faction thing was a little bit rewarding because it taught me. It gave me a ceiling for complexity that I was very aware of and am now very under. And so I think that was actually a good experience doing that. So yeah, frankly, I maybe have one more insurgent faction in me. I have notes for the RLF, but I which could be a minor faction very easily, and I'm out.
Yeah, it's funny. When we were working on Underworld, I wrote this little script that just generated so we had the reach system, which values all the factions, and then there are minimum targets you have to hit for each player count, and I used that to generate a big list of just possible games. And then what I would do is I would go through that list, and it was like many pages, maybe like 30 pages, and I had them in my office of all these games, and I just went through them, and I would like circle ones where I'm like, this one I'm worried about.
You told me you played every one.
Yeah, well, not all of them. I did a pass, right? So I went through it and I circled all the ones I was worried about. Mm-hmm. And then, out of those, we had like about 100 that were just like, these are different combinations and also like things like maps and deck combinations, like all that can take that into account. And then I had about 100 games that we wanted to run. And I was like, well, we can't run all of them. Because we just can't run all of them, because we are going to usually the rule in my mind is that a game gets played about 200 times by its development crew before it's done. And that could be that I play 100 times and Patrick plays 100 times. It could be different combinations, but I knew that this was a lot to get through. And so I went through it again and I was like, okay, if this one works, these other ones are also going to work.
Okay.
And so you kind of map it a little bit like that, where you're like, well, the Woodland Alliance is a little bit more irritating to deal with than the Corvids. So sometimes they can kind of stand in for them. But there are these other faction mixes where the Corvids are a lot more worrisome, like if they're playing against the Eerie, right? Whereas the Woodland Alliance is a lot more troublesome for like the Lizards maybe, right? So they're different alchemies. And so out of that, we got this big list. And then when we were testing it, we hired a bunch of people to come in. We ran about 3 tables. Every day from like 9 to 5, they played about 4 games. Each table played 4 games a day. And I went in there like I was conducting a seminar with little clipboards. I've got them somewhere in my office. And I said, and I had a little data merge spit out like, okay, here are the factions. Here's your map. Here's your deck. And it just spit out all these forms. And I would give every group their clipboard and be like, all right, get these in me by the end of the day. And it was, I just need to see like what they're like when they get played. Now, I don't know exactly how we're going to adapt that system to COVID yet, because it is even bigger than Oath's testing system. But I imagine I'm going to be doing some tricky work with Google Forms and trying to set that stuff up.
Let's make Nick do it.
Yeah, we'll just make Nick do it.
Yeah,
that's what a team's for.
But as we start thinking about like, oh boy, what does this look like if things get really wild, right?
Yeah.
And some of the thinking behind the advanced setup is making the different combinations a little more resilient. So that, for instance, like in the game we played today, the Warlord jumped on my neck as the cats. Now,
which I directed him to do, and it wasn't a good play.
It was not a good play, but it's also a thing that can happen. And I was cheered by the fact that I started thinking about how the current draft and setup system works. I'm like, this probably couldn't happen in quite this way.
Sure.
So like, I think that there are ways that like by adjusting that, we can make the game a little more resilient and maybe generate some more content. But I agree with Patrick. I've got like a couple more root factions in me, but there are so many. There's so much game.
There'll be way more space for that in Void Lich and Oath.
Yeah. And I, one thing I'll say about that is I don't have a copy of Root at the office. My copy is at home, and I try not to use it for development because it'll get messy. And so one of the first things I did at the beginning of this week was build my development copy of Root. So I went around and was like, oh, do you have a full set of Woodland Alliance meeples in that set? Okay, I'll put that in my box. Because I just need to we have all these half copies of Root.
Right.
And putting everything together, I was like, oh boy, there is a lot in this box. Yeah. There's a lot of factions. There's just Like, I think that the system could probably handle a few more, but my goodness.
Well,
And unfortunately, as someone who's monitoring like benefits and shipping stuff from China and to people and managing people, I'm probably gonna have to lean on Cole to do some of this work.
well, I'm super excited about this. This is you guys' next Kickstarter, presumably, that you're going to be putting up. I know that I'm going to get grilled if I don't ask a couple of those like real cut and dry business questions on this. Are you guys going to have the Clockwork expansion 2 as part of this upcoming Kickstarter?
Yep, it's almost done already.
Yeah, I was playing it today.
That's awesome. And then, of course, the question that I bet you guys get a million times: what about a big box? We need something to put all these things in.
Rage quit.
It's a funny. So I feel like I don't know. I don't really want one, but also there have been times when I feel like both Pat and I have been like more accommodating about the idea potentially. Like for a while, it was like, hey, at the end of the line, we'll of course do one. I have started. I don't know if I'm just reacting to people asking me about it or if I actually feel this way earnestly. I've started thinking about it as like an act of harm.
Yeah.
Like I wouldn't want to do it even if we could make money doing it. I don't know. I feel like I have to recuse myself from this conversation because I get too.
The moment I stopped caring about it, like I did care about it. For a long time I was
Oh,
like,
sure.
man, I need the big box. I need the big box. The moment I stopped caring about it is the moment that I got the playmats. I was like, well, it's not going to all fit in one box anyway.
No. It's going to be this big.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I mean, I think I said this last time Pat and I did a design chat, but it bears repeating. I play a lot of Command and Colors. I used to play a lot of Command and Colors Napoleonics with my wife. And after we finished the Austrian expansion, I got this like giant tackle box and I organized it all. I put it in the giant tackle box and we stopped playing it because it was too intimidating. It was too heavy.
Right.
It was like it was just nonsensical. And then I sorted everything back out into their boxes. And then it gets played now. Like, I mean, and it was just, I think part of it, I don't know, it's a complicated thing. And I do think there are ways of designing a big box that make it easier to play. But Root is so, like, you know, that word again, it's like so modular that I kind of, if I'm going to game night, I kind of just want to like grab Root and then like the expansion that I think I'm going to play that night.
So my take on it is, first of all, in my cold, dead heart, if I make money on it, I'll make money on it. So I gotta sell it for that reason. But I think I want to see how the response to Oath and that really well-designed box, because maybe there is a better curated experience than just having a large box. Maybe there is a way we can present a tray that will help the people, and I think that's what people are asking for ultimately. Yeah. They're not saying big box. They're saying we want a tray to store everything. And I think now that we have a better we don't have a better product designer. What we have is time to work on product design and the expertise to work on it. And so maybe like from years ago when I was like to now, there might be some room to run it. My concern about it, and what I always say to people, is that Scythe, which has sold 350,000 units, which is almost double of what Root sold. Jamie wrote a piece about it, and he said you just didn't make money on it. And I was like, well, if someone at that scale with that business acumen cannot make money on a box, I mean, he said he broke even, and so it's like, I can't afford to keep paying benefits if I'm breaking even. I gotta create a world where we continue to generate money. I mean, I get it. Like, you could say, well, you break even, it's okay. But no, Patrick Leder is then going to have to take time away from doing something else. Marshall's going to have to take time away from doing something else to break even. And that's not as exciting.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I completely agree with you, Patrick, and I think that the Oath box is going to be a really interesting case on it because we spent a long time on that box, a long time. Like, it took staff days to figure out how it was going to work. That was time that could have been spent in other places, and it was important for the product. But in Oath's big box is funny because it's not flashy. Oath's big box. Oath's box.
It's got a picture of a pig on it.
Okay. It does have a picture on a pig, but it's not a flashy box design, but it is a bigger form factor. And it was the first time as a company we've made a really active attempt to get the insert to be like post-game functional.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Like I feel like a lot of our inserts are like, the insert works great if this is the only product you buy. If you have an expansion, you're on your own.
I love every Kickstarter that comes with an expansion out of the gate. You're like,
Yeah,
oh,
you just throw
Yep,
that insert out.
Yeah.
But Oath actually has an insert that people are going to want to keep. I challenge the Meeple Realty people to design a better.
to design it better. I like,
Better.
you know, it's funny though. I do like the Sentinels box. It's ridiculous. I was gonna see if I can get a picture of it quick. It is enormous, but I've played the game more since I got it because
that's cool.
All the heroes are together. So,
Well, Cole, Patrick, I could talk to you about a million things. One thing that I'm personally very excited about is Void Lich on the horizon. I mean, I know that you've put up some pictures of the development, you've talked about it, and so as a hopefully 2021 release, or maybe at least a Kickstarter,
definitely
for that, I would love to
nice. Thank you.
have you guys back onto the show. I mean, I could just talk about business, I could talk about game design, but at this point, I need to let you guys go so you can actually make some games. So let's leave it with getting the question out of the way here. The Root Kickstarter, when can people find or expect that?
So are we talking about that yet?
We've talked a little bit
Brooke in
about
the room
it.
with you?
Yeah, Brooke Curry.
We need levels of permission here.
Yeah, so our general plan is that the Root Kickstarter will happen in Q1.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be a blast for folks who had a good time with the Underworld Kickstarter. This is going to be, it's going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to it. So that's our Q1. Oath hopefully will be having its retail release, like potentially sometime around June, kind of end of Q2. Void Lich, which is really like, it's going to be an awesome studio project. We could gab for a long time about how it's going. Will be our second Kickstarter. Hope maybe sometime like around May. We're not really sure, April or May.
April, May. Yeah.
I think that like the main thing I would want to communicate to folks is like we have been Oath. So like the studio was growing especially after Root. I mean, it grew through Vast, it grew through Root. But we spent a lot of that growth on Oath. Oath was a complicated project that took a lot of the bandwidth we had built out. And this is going to be a year where instead of doing one giant project, we're doing kind of like a bunch of medium-sized projects. And they are all very different from each other. And so we're going to have a lot to share. And that'll start getting rolling kind of like right as the new year turns.
Well,
Very excited about Void Lich because the three of us are meeting about it. If you Kyle, like if you talk about the senior creative staff, it's us all kind of chipping away at it right now, and so I'm just I think it's gonna be like a culmination of a lot of efforts coming together, and I think it's gonna be very cool to that Kickstarter is gonna be very cool. It's very cool to see how it turns out.
Yeah, it is both very unlike anything that we've done before, and also like a clear continuation of some of these lines of thought. Yeah.
I say it turns out because it's a lot on Cole's desk right now.
It is super on my desk right now. It's been so fun to work on it. Like Oath. One thing I'll say about working on Void Lich is Oath was a very deliberative and kind of slow design because the design had to accommodate just like tons of tricky things. So it was like I couldn't design quickly, which I like to design fast, but Oath that was like not allowed because if I was hasty, I would like break like 4 months of work, and so it had to be careful. And Void Lich is not like that. Void Lich is the core action system is like very flexible and strong, and so the design. I think the design is going to Oath, I think of as a very special, unique game, and no game does anything like it. Void Lich is as dynamic, but it's a simpler game to learn how to play, and I think it's going to have some really wonderful stuff in the box. And I can't wait to talk more about that game. Cool. So I have to stop myself.
We'll find a time to do it. Well, thank you so much, Cole and Patrick, for coming on to the show. This has been an absolute blast.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great.